The city at night was a cold, indifferent machine. Neon lights flickered over rain-slicked streets as the evening rush faded into a hollow silence. Elena Ward, a tired ER nurse, walked out of the hospital, her shoulders heavy after a brutal 14-hour shift. In her wallet, she had less than $20, her last bit of security. On the sidewalk ahead, a man sat huddled in rags, shivering, defeated. Thousands had walked past him. Elena walked past too. She went 5 steps, then stopped. She didn't know that turning back would rewrite her entire life. History was made. Truth finally revealed. The master had returned. Elena Ward was 28 years old, and at this exact moment, she felt like a battery that had been drained to its absolute zero. Her feet were throbbing inside her worn-out sneakers, a dull, rhythmic ache that pulsed with every step she took on the cold, unforgiving concrete. She had just finished a grueling double shift at Metropolitan General, a massive factory of miracles where time was measured not in hours, but in medication doses and the frantic, unrelenting beeping of cardiac monitors. Her light blue scrubs were wrinkled, stained with the ghost of a coffee ring from a break she barely remembered taking 4 hours ago, and her hair was pulled back in a messy bun that was slowly unraveling in the damp night air. To the few people still wandering the late-night streets, Elena was effectively a ghost. In the grand, loud hierarchy of the city, she was just another anonymous medical worker heading home to a cramped studio apartment and a dinner consisting of whatever was left in the back of her fridge. People didn't see the woman who had spent her entire afternoon holding the hand of a dying veteran or calculating life-saving dosages in the middle of a chaotic trauma code. They didn't see the scars on her knuckles from years of rhythmic CPR or the depth of the medical library she carried in her mind. They just saw a tired woman with deep shadows under her eyes, a nobody in the sea of city lights. The atmosphere of the city at dusk was a heavy, stagnant mixture of exhaust fumes and the distant, lonely hum of sirens. It was a world in a constant hurry, where empathy was often a luxury that no one felt they could afford. Elena clutched her bag to her side, her mind already drifting toward the silence of her room, trying to ignore the biting wind that seemed to find every gap in her thin jacket. She felt the weight of the city pressing against her chest, a silence that suggested that, in this landscape of steel and glass, if you didn't have a title or a bank account, you didn't exist. The streetlights above hummed with a low-frequency buzz, a mocking reminder of the technology that surrounded her, yet provided no warmth for the soul. But Elena's exhaustion wasn't just physical, it was financial. Her bank account was a desert, and her next paycheck was still 4 long days away. After paying her overdue rent and a mountain of student loans that felt like a permanent anchor around her neck, she was left with exactly $18.50. That was her food for the week, her bus fare, her only margin of safety in a city that didn't offer second chances. She thought about the godlike surgeons she worked with, men and women whose names were on the hospital wings, and she realized that out here, in the dirt and the noise, she was just as vulnerable as the people she treated. She felt the thinness of her own safety net, realizing how close anyone could be to the edge. As she reached the corner of 4th and Oak, the rhythm of her walk slowed. There, leaning against the cold brick of an abandoned storefront, was a man. He was dressed in layers of frayed, soot-stained rags that looked as old as the city itself. His hands were tucked into his sleeves, but they were trembling with a fine, rapid tremor that Elena's clinical eyes recognized instantly as the onset of hypothermia. His head was bowed, his face hidden in the shadows of a grimy hood. He looked like a discarded piece of trash in the middle of a world that only valued the shiny and the new. Elena walked past him. She really did. Her mind screamed at her to keep moving. "You have nothing to give, Elena. You're broke. You're tired. You've already saved 3 lives today. Someone else with more resources will stop." She took 5 heavy steps, the distance between her and the man widening. She was almost at the subway entrance, the promise of a warm bed just a train ride away. But then, the lighthouse instinct kicked in. It was the same instinct that made her check a patient's vitals one last time before leaving the floor. The instinct that refused to let a pulse fade in the dark. She stopped. The silence of the street suddenly felt louder than the traffic. Elena thought about her $18. She thought about the cheap sandwich she was going to buy for dinner. She thought about the security that those few bills represented. To a millionaire, $18 is a tip. To Elena, it was a lifeline. This was the real conflict. The hardest kindness isn't giving when you have plenty. It's giving when you are just as hungry as the person you are helping. She stood there for 3 long seconds, watching her own breath mist in the air. She realized that if it were her sitting on that freezing concrete, she wouldn't be looking for a hero with a cape. She'd just be looking for one person who was willing to see her. She turned around. She didn't do it because she was a saint. She did it because she couldn't live with the silence if she didn't. She was the code whisperer of the street, and she had just decided that her own hunger could wait. The shadow of the man became the center of her universe. If you believe kindness is a choice, not a habit, comment, "That is unfair." Elena walked back toward the man, her sneakers squeaking softly on the damp pavement. She didn't approach him with pity or fear. She approached him with the laminar flow of a professional. In the ER, you don't judge the blood on the clothes. You only look at the person inside them. She knelt a respectful 2 feet away, lowering herself so they were eye to eye. "Hey, can you hear me?" she asked. Her voice was low, melodic, and completely devoid of the condescension that usually accompanies charity. It was the specific frequency she used for patients who were waking up from a nightmare. The man didn't move at first, his breathing ragged and shallow. She could smell the scent of wood smoke and the metallic tang of old exhaust on his rags. "I'm a nurse. I work right there in the hospital," Elena said, pointing toward the glowing towers of Metropolitan General behind them. "You look really cold, sir. I just want to make sure you're okay." Slowly, the man raised his head. His face was weathered, his skin like old parchment, and his eyes were bloodshot from the biting wind. But there was a strange, piercing clarity in his gaze that Elena didn't expect. He didn't look like a man who had lost his mind. He looked like a man who was measuring the weight of her soul. There was an ancient intelligence behind that exhaustion, a flicker of something that didn't belong in the gutter. "I'm fine," he rasped, the words sounding like dry leaves on asphalt. "Just resting." Elena reached out, her fingers gently brushing his wrist, not to hold his hand, but to check his capillary refill. "Your hands are freezing, and your pulse is a little thready," she said, her mind already running through a triage checklist. "You need something warm in your system, or your heart is going to start working way too hard to keep you warm, and tonight is not the night for that." The man looked at her navy scrubs, then at her tired eyes. "Go home, nurse. You look like you've seen enough trouble today. You look like the city has already taken everything you have." Elena chuckled, a soft, weary sound that carried the weight of her shift. "Trouble is my job description, Arthur. But I'm also a human being. And right now, I'm a human being with a choice." She reached into her bag and pulled out her wallet. She stared at the $10 bill, the $5 bill, and the 3 singles tucked inside. She knew that if she spent this, she'd be walking to work tomorrow. She'd be skipping lunch. She'd be relying on the free crackers in the break room to survive the day. She pulled out the $10 and stood up. "Stay right here," she commanded, the tone of a lead nurse returning to her voice. She walked half a block to a late-night deli, the bell chiming with a cheerful sound that felt out of place in the cold. The air inside was warm and smelled of toasted bread and roasted meat. The clerk behind the counter looked at Elena's scrubs and then at the shivering man outside the window. He gave a small, cynical shake of his head. "You're wasting your money, honey. He'll be back there tomorrow." Elena didn't blink. She didn't argue. "I'm not buying his tomorrow," she said, her voice firm and resonant. "I'm buying his now." She felt the weight of the $10 bill as it left her hand, a sacrifice that felt more profound than any donation she had ever made in her life. She looked at the menu. She could have bought herself a feast, but she bought a large hot tea, a thick turkey sandwich, and a pair of heavy wool socks she saw on a display near the register. When the cashier handed her the change, she had exactly $3 left, the cost of her pride and her dinner. She walked back to the man and handed him the tea first. "Sip this slowly. Don't gulp it, or you'll shock your stomach. Just feel the heat in your hands first." She watched him wrap his shaking hands around the cardboard cup, the steam rising up to soften the deep lines on his face. She didn't ask him how he ended up there. She didn't ask why he didn't have a coat. She simply knelt there and opened the sandwich for him, placing the wrapper on his lap like a sterile drape. The man's eyes tracked her every movement, recording the precision of her care. The man took a bite, his eyes never leaving Elena's. It wasn't the look of a starving animal. It was the look of a scientist observing a miracle in a lab. He saw her check her watch. He saw the way she hid her own shivering hands in her pockets. He saw the truth that the world usually hides, that the people who have the least are often the ones who give the most because they know exactly what it feels like to have nothing. Elena realized that in this moment, the hierarchy of the city had inverted. She was the provider and the street was her ward. This wasn't charity, it was recognition. If you realize the hardest kindness is giving when you don't have enough, comment, "I was wrong." Elena didn't leave immediately after the tea was finished. Despite the wind and the fact that her own body was screaming for a bed, she sat down on the sidewalk beside the man. She didn't sit above him like a benefactor. She sat with him, shoulder to shoulder against the cold brick. She wanted him to know that for 20 minutes, he wasn't a problem to be solved, but a person to be known. The rough texture of the wall pressed against her back, mirroring the hardness of the world around them. The silence was profound. The city's roar felt distant, as if they were in a bubble of truth in a world of noise. "Most people don't stop," the man said after a long time, his voice a bit stronger now, the warmth of the tea finally reaching his core. Elena leaned her head back against the wall, watching a single star try to shine through the light pollution of the skyscraper towers. "Most people are tired," she replied softly. "They have their own storms to fight, their own bills, their own ghosts. It's easier to look at the ground than to look at someone else's pain, because if you look, you have to acknowledge that it could be you." "And you?" the man asked, tilting his head toward her. "You look like you're fighting a bigger storm than most. I see the way you hold your bag. You're protecting more than just your phone." He was looking at her knuckles, seeing the faint white scars of a life lived in the service of others. Elena gave a small, honest smile. "I'm a nurse, sir. I've been trained to ignore my own storm to help someone else through theirs. Sometimes I forget how to turn that part of my brain off, even when the storm is inside my own bank account." They sat there for 20 minutes. Elena didn't realize it, but she was performing a technique called limbic resonance, where her calm, steady presence was helping the man's nervous system regulate itself after hours of survival stress. She spoke about the hospital, about the small victories she had seen, the way a baby cried for the first time, or the way an old man had smiled when he saw his wife after surgery. She didn't talk about being broke. She didn't talk about the overdue utility bill sitting on her counter, but the man felt the tension in her frame. But the man was observant. He was more than observant. He was analytical. He noticed the way Elena's hand hovered over her bag when her phone buzzed, a notification for an action required on her student loan portal that she quickly silenced. He saw the worn-out soles of her sneakers and the way she bit her lip when she thought about the 4-mile walk home because she couldn't afford the bus. He realized that this woman wasn't just giving from her surplus. She was giving from her marrow. She was a lighthouse in a city of darkness, a ghost helping a ghost. "What is your name, nurse?" he asked, his voice now carrying a strange, resonant authority that vibrated through the cold air. "Elena," she said. "And yours?" "Arthur," he replied, and for a split second, the name carried a weight that didn't match the rags he was wearing. "Thank you, Elena, not just for the tea, but for the socks, and for the seat. It's been a long time since anyone sat next to me without a barrier between us, without looking through me." Elena stood up, her knees cracking in the cold. She felt the exhaustion return to her bones, a heavy tide pulling her toward the earth. "I should get going, Arthur. I have to be back in the pit in 8 hours, and I have a long journey ahead of me." She reached into her pocket and pulled out her last $3, the bus fare for the morning. She looked at the crumpled bills, knowing that if she gave them away, she would be walking in the rain tomorrow morning. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, a final tiny battle between survival and soul, and then she pressed the bills into his palm. This was the final bridge, the last piece of herself she had to give. Get a bus somewhere warm tomorrow morning, she whispered. She didn't wait for him to argue. She didn't wait for him to see the tears of exhaustion that were finally starting to prick her eyes as the adrenaline of the shift faded. She turned and walked away into the shadows of the city. Her wallet was now completely empty, but as she walked the 4 miles to her apartment, she realized her heart felt curiously full. She had spent her last cent to buy a stranger 20 minutes of dignity, and as she climbed the stairs to her dark room, she felt a peace that no paycheck could ever provide. She was the code whisperer, and she had just held the line against the cold. The city felt a little less indifferent. If you believe being present for someone is more powerful than words, comment, I am indebted. The next 3 days were a blur of hunger and long walks for Elena Ward. She drank a lot of hospital water and lived on the free crackers and stale coffee in the break room. She told herself it was a cleanse, but her body knew the truth. She was vibrating with fatigue, her hands occasionally shaking as she adjusted IV drips. She was waiting for Friday morning so she could finally check her bank account and buy a real meal. The world seemed to move in slow motion, every patient's heartbeat mirroring her own hollow pulse. Near the end of her rotation on Thursday, the head nurse, Sarah, approached her with a strange, unsettled expression. Elena, there's a call for you at the nursing station. Someone from a high-level corporate office? They say it's personal and urgent. Elena's heart sank into her shoes. Is it a debt collector? Did the rent check finally bounce? Am I being sued for that student loan? She walked to the phone with a heavy dread, her mind replaying every financial mistake she had ever made. The fluorescent light seemed brighter, more clinical, more accusatory. This is Elena Ward, she said, her voice shaky and small. Miss Ward, my name is Marcus. I'm the chief of staff for Sterling Hayes Industries. The voice on the other end was professional, sharp, and carried the weight of billions. A vehicle is waiting for you at the main hospital entrance. Our chairman would like to speak with you immediately. It concerns a private matter from earlier this week. Elena was confused, but something in the name Sterling Hayes sparked a memory. She had seen that name etched in gold on the hospital's newest surgical wing. When she walked out of the hospital, she didn't find her usual bus stop. She found a sleek black sedan with tinted windows and a driver who stood at attention. The driver opened the door without a word, gesturing for her to enter the leather-scented interior. The silence inside the car was a luxury she didn't know how to process. 30 minutes later, she was standing in a penthouse office that overlooked the entire city. The glass walls made the world below look like a map of light. The carpet was so thick it felt like walking on a cloud. Standing by the massive window was a man. He was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than Elena's entire nursing education. His hair was neatly combed, his posture commanding, and his presence filled the room with a density that was almost suffocating. The smell of cedar and expensive paper replaced the antiseptic scent of her world. When he turned around, Elena gasped, the breath leaving her lungs in a sharp, audible hiss. It was Arthur. His eyes were the same piercing clarity and ancient wisdom she had seen on the sidewalk. But the rags were gone, replaced by the armor of immense wealth. The dirt was washed away, revealing a man who looked like he owned the very air she was breathing. He looked like he had been restored, not just in clothes, but in spirit. You came, Arthur said, a small, knowing smile on his face. Even after a long shift, even without knowing why, you still followed the call. Arthur, Elena whispered, her legs feeling like they were made of water. I don't understand. What was that night? Were you testing me? Was this some kind of game for you? Arthur walked toward her, his movements fluid and confident, the heavy silk of his suit whispering against his skin. I wasn't testing you, Elena. I was testing the world. I had lost my faith in the city I helped build. I had begun to believe that we had all become part of the machine, cold, efficient, and utterly indifferent to the heartbeat of our neighbors. I sat on that corner for 6 hours. 3,000 people walked past. Some spat, some laughed. Most ignored me as if I were a ghost. Only one person stopped. Only one person spent her last dollar on a man who had nothing to give back. He looked at her worn-out sneakers and the shadows under her eyes that even the penthouse light couldn't hide. I wanted to see who would help when there was no reward, And I found the raven. I found the master of the detail who saw the man behind the rags. Truth had been served. He reached out and touched her hand, the same hand that had checked his pulse in the dark. If you believe who you are matters more than what you know, comment, I will live kindly. Arthur didn't pull out a checkbook immediately. He didn't try to buy the kindness she had given him for free, because he knew that would insult the very thing he was trying to honor. Instead, he walked over to his mahogany desk and picked up a small, familiar object. It was the pair of wool socks Elena had bought him with her last $10. They were framed in a glass box, resting on his desk like a sacred relic of a forgotten religion. To him, they were more valuable than the skyscrapers outside. You didn't see a millionaire that night, Elena, Arthur said, his voice soft but resonant, echoing in the vast space of the office. You saw a human being, and because you did, you gave me back my faith in the work I do. You reminded me that the baseline is still there, and now I'm going to help you become the leader this city needs. He didn't just give her a reward, he gave her a mission. He announced that he was establishing the Ward Foundation, a full funding scholarship and research grant for trauma nurses who worked in the city's toughest, most overlooked zones. Elena was to be the executive director. Her student debt was wiped clean with a single stroke of a pen. Her cramped apartment was upgraded to a place where she could actually see the sun rise, and her future was secured beyond her wildest dreams. But more importantly, he gave her the power to change the very system that had made her so tired. He gave her the resources to ensure that no nurse would ever have to choose between their own dinner and the dignity of a stranger. He gave her the tools to heal the healers. Elena stood by the window of the penthouse looking down at the tiny distant corner where she had sat just 3 nights ago. She realized that the $18 she had lost was the greatest investment she had ever made. Not because it brought her wealth, but because it proved that kindness is the only currency that doesn't lose value in a crisis. It is the only thing that remains solid when everything else melts away. It was the anchor in the storm. The story of the broke nurse and the millionaire in rags became a legend at Metropolitan General. But Elena didn't change. She still arrived early for her shifts, she still checked the ventilator valves herself, and she still sat on the floor with patients who were scared, even when she wore a silk blouse instead of navy scrubs. She knew that the soul of a healer doesn't change with the clothes on its back. We often think that to change the world, we need $1 million or a high-ranking title. But Elena Ward proved that all you really need is the courage to take 5 steps. Stop and turn back. The next time you walk past someone who looks like they have nothing to offer the world, remember Arthur's socks. Remember that the person in front of you might be a king in disguise, or they might just be a soul waiting for a reason to keep breathing. Be that reason. Be the lighthouse. Real strength is quiet. Real value is hidden in the details. And real heroes don't care if the world ever knows their names. They only care that the mission of humanity is complete. Be the observer. Be the master of the detail. Be the truth. Because in the end, it's not what you have in your bank account that defines your legacy. It's what you were willing to give when the account was empty. It's the $18 that saved a millionaire's soul. That is the power of the silent professional. And that is the lasting lesson of the nurse who turned back. Her heartbeat became the city's compass. If you believe the kindest actions are the ones done when no one is watching, and when you have the least to give, leave a comment below. And if this story reminds you that who you choose to be in the smallest moments can change everything, don't forget to subscribe for more.